I was halfway through chapter 41 when I died. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only thing I have left that feels like mine. It was 11:40 at night. I was in bed, propped against two pillows, my phone screen too bright in the dark room, and I was reading the chapter where Lord Ashvale, the man everyone in the comments called the worst husband in the genre, the man whose name alone got 100 angry replies every time he appeared, stood alone in his study and burned a letter he had never sent. The chapter didn't say what was in the letter. It just said he burned it, and then stood there until the flame reached his fingers and didn't move. I remember thinking, that's strange. Why would they give him a moment like that? He's not supposed to have moments like that. And then my chest did something it had never done before, a tightness that wasn't quite pain, more like a hand closing slowly around something, and the phone slipped out of my fingers, and the room tilted very gently, the way a boat tilts when the water shifts beneath it, and the light from the screen smeared into a long bright line across the ceiling. I didn't feel afraid. That's the part one still don't fully understand. I had time, not much, but some, to feel something, and what I felt was a kind of mild surprise, the way you feel when you realize you've left the stove on after you've already left the house. Oh, I thought, that's what this is. Then nothing. Then, a ceiling. Not my ceiling. Higher, paneled in dark wood, with a chandelier I had never owned hanging dark and unlit above me, and morning light coming through tall windows with curtains the color of wine. I was lying in a bed that was not my bed, in a room that was not my room, wearing a nightgown made of a fabric I didn't recognize, and for a long moment I simply lay there or did the thing my body was apparently already doing, lying there, and let my mind catch up to where the rest of me already was. This is Ashvale Manor, I thought, and the thought arrived with the strange double quality of something I was realizing and something I had always known, both at once. This is chapter 1. This is the morning after the wedding. I sat up. There was a mirror across the room, tall and gilt-framed, and in it was a woman I had read 400 pages of furious commentary about. Dark hair, pale, composed face, the kind of beauty the book had described as cold, though looking at it now, in the morning light, it didn't look cold to me. It looked like a face that had learned, very early, to give nothing away. Lady Adrian Ashvale, I thought. The villain's wife. The woman who spent 400 pages chasing a man who wasn't her husband, and humiliated the man who was, and died. I remembered this now, the memory arriving the way all the others had, complete and certain, in 6 months, in the same fire that ends Lord Ashvale's storyline, because she went back into a burning house for a man who had never once looked at her the way he was about to look at someone else. I sat in that bed, in that body, in that morning, and I thought about the chapter I had been reading when I died. The letter, the flame reaching his fingers. The fact that the book had given him, just once, a moment of something that wasn't villainy, and had never explained it, because by then the story had already decided what he was, and what he was going to lose, and that I, Adrian, was not going to be in the room when it happened. I thought, I don't care about Prince Tobias. I want to say that clearly, because everything that follows depends on it. The original, Adrian had spent years of her life arranging herself to be seen by a man who had never once arranged anything to see her back. I had read about it. I had rolled my eyes at it, in my old life, in my old bed, on the night I died. I felt nothing for him. Not interest, not curiosity, not even the dutiful obligation to find him handsome because the book said he was. He was a stranger, a plot device, a man I had never met and had no reason to meet. But I had married, Adrian had married, 6 months ago, in a ceremony I now remembered attending without ever once looking at the man beside her, a man the book had spent 400 pages teaching me to hate. And I had just watched him burn a letter he never sent, and stand there until the flame reached his fingers, and not move. This is that story. The first person to enter the room was a maid, a girl of perhaps 17 with her hair pinned back so tightly it looked painful, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw me sitting up, and her face did something complicated, surprise, quickly hidden, replaced with the careful blankness of someone trained not to react. "My lady," she said. "You're awake early." I looked at her, and the name arrived the way the rest had. Hattie. Assigned to Lady Adrian's chambers 3 months ago, after the previous girl asked to be reassigned. The previous girl had asked to be reassigned. I filed that away. I am, I said, and heard my own voice, Adrian's voice, for the first time. Lower than I expected. Even. What time does Lord Ashvale take breakfast? Hattie's hands, which had been reaching for the curtain ties, stopped. She started, and then seemed to reconsider whatever she had been about to say. He takes it in his study, my lady. At 7. He doesn't, another stop. He usually takes it alone. He usually takes it alone. I thought about the 400 pages. I thought about how many of them had described, from a distance, a marriage that existed primarily on paper. Two people who occupied the same enormous house and arranged their days so that they would not have to occupy the same room in it. I thought about how the book had framed this as something Adrian did to him, her absence, her indifference, dressed up as cruelty because she was always somewhere else, chasing someone else. But someone has to start eating alone first. What time is it now? I asked. 20 minutes past 6, my lady. Then I have time to dress, I said, and Hattie's face did the complicated thing again, more visibly this time, and I understood. The way I was beginning to understand a great many things, in the specific compressed way of someone whose memories and current life were arriving on slightly different schedules, that Adrian did not usually dress before 9. That Adrian did not usually leave her rooms before noon. That whatever I did in the next half hour was going to be the first piece of information the entire household had about whatever had happened to her overnight. I dressed. I chose, from the wardrobe Hattie opened with visible uncertainty, the plainest gown available, a deep gray blue, high-collared, the kind of dress that said nothing except I am dressed and I am here. Hattie did my hair simply, at my request, and when she was finished she stood back and looked at me in the mirror with an expression I couldn't immediately place. It took me until I was at the door to understand what it was. It was the look of someone watching a person they had decided, a long time ago, not to feel anything about, and finding, unexpectedly, that there might be something there to feel after all. I walked down to the study at 6:58. The house was enormous, and I navigated it the way Adrian would have, which is to say, the memories supplied the turns before I had to think about them, a strange sensation like being a passenger in your own competence. Down the east stair, along the gallery with the portraits, I did not look at them, though I felt the memory note that I usually did not look at them either, for reasons that were not yet clear to me. Through the smaller dining room, to the door of the study, which was closed, with light showing beneath it. I knocked. There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if I had misjudged something, if this was already a mistake, if 6:58 in the morning was itself an offense in a marriage where the rules had apparently been do not appear, and then a voice said, "Enter," in a tone that suggested whoever was on the other side expected a servant. I opened the door. Lord Ashvale, Damien, the memories supplied, though I had never once, in 400 pages of fury at this man, heard anyone call him that, was seated behind a wide desk covered in papers, a cup of something steaming beside his hand, and when he looked up and saw who had opened the door, something happened to his face that I will spend the rest of this story trying to describe accurately, because it was the first true thing I learned about him, and almost everything after followed from it. He went still, not surprised, exactly, or not only surprised. Still, the way a person goes still when they are recalibrating very quickly, trying to determine what is about to be required of them, what version of a familiar interaction they are about to have to perform. "Adrian," he said, careful, neutral, a man opening a door he expected to lead somewhere unpleasant. He was younger than I had pictured him, reading the book. The illustrations, there had been illustrations, in the digital edition, the kind that accompanied major chapters, had given him sharp dark brows and an expression permanently arranged into something between contempt and boredom, and the description text had spent 400 pages reinforcing it. Cold, calculating, the kind of man who smiled only when something was about to go wrong for someone else. The man behind the desk looked tired. That was the thing the illustrations hadn't shown, and the text hadn't said, because the text was written from a distance that didn't allow for it, from rooms he wasn't in, by a narrator who had decided what he was before ever describing what he looked like at 7 in the morning, alone, before anyone else in the house was awake. He looked tired, and wary, and like a man bracing for something. "I didn't mean to disturb you," I said. "I wanted to ask whether I might join you for breakfast. I understand that isn't usual. I can go, if—" "No," he said, too quickly. Then, more carefully, "No. That's," he gestured, vaguely, at the chair across from his desk, the kind of gesture a man makes when he doesn't have a script for the situation and is improvising one in real time. "You may sit." I sat. A servant appeared. I hadn't heard anyone summoned, but the household clearly ran on a rhythm I wasn't yet attuned to, and a second setting appeared on the desk, pushed slightly to the side to make room amid the papers, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and I used the silence to look at him properly. He was perhaps 30, dark hair, cut shorter and plainer than I'd expected from a man the book had dressed, in every scene, in black. There were ink stains on the side of his right hand. The papers on his desk, I could see now, were ledgers, Columns of figures, several pages thick, with notes in the margins in handwriting too small and too careful for someone who didn't expect anyone else to ever read it. "You're looking at my desk," he said. Not an accusation, just an observation, delivered in the flat tone of a man cataloging evidence. "I am," I said. "Are those the estate accounts?" He looked at me for a long moment. "Why would you ask that?" It was a fair question, and I didn't have an answer that wouldn't require explaining several hundred things I couldn't explain, so I said the truest thing I could find that fit inside the space available. "Because I've never asked before," I said. "And I'd like to start." I learned more about my situation in the next 3 days from the servants than I did from anyone who might have been expected to tell me directly, which was, I came to understand, the entire shape of the problem. Hattie, once she stopped expecting me to do something cruel, turned out to be observant and quietly talkative, in the way of someone who has spent months saying nothing and has a great deal stored up. "The staff don't dislike him," she told me, on the second morning, while pinning my hair in the simple style I'd asked for again. "I know what the talk says. But it isn't true. He pays fairly. He doesn't shout. Old Mrs. Pemberton in the kitchens has been here since his father's time and she says he's the easiest master she's served, compared to," she stopped. "Compared to his father," I said. It wasn't a guess. The memory was there, faint but present. A man even colder than his son, a household run on fear rather than indifference, a boy who had learned early that the safest thing to be was unnoticed. Hattie nodded, carefully, the way people nod when they're confirming something they didn't expect you to already know. "He just doesn't," she searched for the word. "He doesn't expect anything good to happen to him, my lady. That's the whole of it, if you ask me. He's not unkind. He's just stopped expecting kindness, and a person who's stopped expecting something stops looking like they want it, and then everyone treats them like they don't." I thought about the 400 pages. I thought about how the narrative had described him, cold, calculating, and how those words were technically accurate and entirely, fundamentally wrong. The way a photograph of someone mid-sentence can be technically accurate and still capture nothing true about what they were saying. And I chose my words carefully. The previous arrangement. Before things were the way they've been. Was it always like this? Separate breakfasts. Separate everything? Hattie's hands paused in my hair. "My lady," she said. "Are you asking me to tell you about yourself?" "I'm asking you to tell me what you saw," I said. She was quiet for a moment, finishing the pin she was working on, and then she met my eyes in the mirror. Which was, I would learn, the way the staff in this house delivered anything difficult, sideways, through glass, where it was easier for everyone. "You used to leave the house most days before you woke," she said. "To go to the palace gardens, or wherever Prince Tobias was expected to be. Sometimes you didn't come back until very late. And when his lordship asked, once, early on, I heard it myself, where you'd been, you told him it wasn't his business, and he never asked again." She paused. "He stopped asking anything, my lady. Not just that. Everything. Whether you'd eaten, whether you were well, whether you'd be home for dinner. He just stopped. And I think, watching it happen, that it cost him something each time, and after enough times there wasn't anything left to cost." I sat very still. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "You're different," Hattie said. Quietly. Not quite a question. Since the fever, my lady. Whatever it was, 3 nights ago. You're different. The fever. That was what they were calling it. The night Adrian had, presumably, collapsed, and I had woken up in her place. A fever explained a great deal. The long sleep, the disorientation, the change in manner that might otherwise have required an explanation nobody in this world could provide. "I think I am," I said. "I think the fever changed some things. I'd like to keep most of them, if I can." Hattie smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her, and went back to my hair, and didn't ask anything else. I found the burned letter on the 4th day. Not the letter itself. That was ash, long since cleared away, the memory of the scene in the book occurring sometime in the future relative to where I now stood, a chapter I had read but that hadn't happened yet in this timeline, which was its own kind of vertigo I was learning to live with. What I found was the desk drawer where it would have been kept, in the small sitting room attached to the study, a room I'd begun using in the mornings, ostensibly to read, actually because it let me be near him without the formality of the study itself, and because I had started, without entirely deciding to, paying attention to the patterns of the house. The drawer was locked. It was the only locked drawer in a room of unlocked ones, and that alone would have caught my attention, but what caught it more was the quality of the lock. Old, slightly rusted, the kind of lock that had been put on a drawer a long time ago and never replaced, on a piece of furniture that otherwise looked relatively new. He'd brought this desk with him. from somewhere else, and kept the old lock. I didn't try to open it. I want to be clear about that. I want to be clear about a great many things in this story, but that one matters more than most. I didn't pick the lock, didn't ask Hattie to find a key, didn't do any of the things a person in a story like this is supposed to do when they find a locked drawer that obviously contains the secret. I just noticed it, and then, a few days later, I asked him about it, not the drawer specifically, but the desk. This was your father's, I said. We were in the small sitting room. He'd come to find a ledger and found me there instead, and after the first startled moment, he startled, still, every time he found me somewhere unexpected, as though my presence in any room was a fact that needed re-verifying each time. He'd stayed, which was new, and was sitting across from me with the ledger open and mostly unread. No, he said, it was my mother's. I hadn't known that. The memories I'd inherited were Adrian's, and Adrian, it was becoming clear, had never asked. She died when I was young, he said, in the same flat cataloging tone he used for most facts about himself, as though delivering information about a stranger. Before my father, before things were the way they became. I don't remember her well. But I remember this desk. It was in her sitting room, and after she died my father had it moved to storage, and when I came of age I had it moved here instead. He paused. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because I asked, I said. And because, I think, no one else has, in a while. He looked at me, that recalibrating stillness again, the look of a man checking and rechecking a measurement that kept coming back different than he expected. You're very different, he said. Echo of Hattie's words, though he couldn't have known that. Since the fever. I know, I said. I'm sorry it took a fever. He didn't answer that, but he didn't leave, either, and we sat in the small room with the ledger open between us, and after a while he started explaining, without my asking, what the columns of figures actually meant, and I listened, and asked questions, and the questions were good ones, because Adrian's memories included things I hadn't expected. Numbers, mostly. An old tutor, before the marriage, who'd taught her accounts alongside her sisters and been quietly impressed and never mentioned it to anyone, because a young noblewoman who was good with figures was not considered an asset worth advertising. I was good with figures. Damien Ashvale did not yet know that about his wife, because his wife had never had a reason to show him, and he had never had a reason to ask. By the end of that afternoon, he had. The invitation arrived on the 6th day, and the moment Hattie brought it to me, a heavy cream envelope, sealed with a crest I didn't recognize but the memories did, instantly, with a flinch, I understood that this was going to be the first real test of whatever I was building. The Dowager Countess Bellwether, Hattie said, watching my face carefully. She hosts a dinner every season. It's, my lady, it's considered a significant honor to be invited. And a significant insult to decline. The memories supplied the rest. The Dowager Countess was Damien's great-aunt by marriage, the last surviving member of an older generation who remembered his mother, who had, by reputation, never much cared for his father, and who held, once a season, a small formal dinner that functioned as a kind of unofficial census of which families were still considered worth knowing. Adrian had attended exactly twice in 6 years of marriage, both times alone, both times, the memory arrived with a faint unpleasant heat, like touching something that had been left too long in the sun, both times having told Damien, the morning of, that she'd forgotten to mention it, in a tone that made clear the forgetting had been deliberate. We'll both attend, I said. Hattie's eyebrows rose, very slightly, before she caught herself. Both, my lady? Both, I said. Please have something sent to Lord Ashvale's rooms, whatever the correct formal attire is. And ask Mrs. Pemberton if the household has anything appropriate for a gift. The Countess will expect one, won't she? She will, Hattie said slowly. Though, my lady, if I may. His lordship doesn't usually attend these things. Even when he's invited separately, which he sometimes is, in his own name. He says, she stopped. What does he say? He says it's easier for everyone if he doesn't, Hattie said. I've heard him say it. To Mr. Albright, the steward, when the Countess's invitations come. It's easier for everyone if I don't. I thought about that phrase for the rest of the afternoon. Easier for everyone. Not I don't want to. Not I'd rather not. A phrase that had already done the work of removing himself from the room before anyone else had to do it for him. The specific, exhausted courtesy of a man who had decided, at some point, that his own absence was a kindness he could offer to people who'd never asked for it. I found him in the study, in the evening, and told him about the invitation, and watched the familiar bracing settle over his face, the look of a man already composing the sentence that would let him out of the room. You should go, he said. I'll send my apologies. The Countess won't mind, she's used to it. I'd like you to come, I said. Adrian, I know it's easier if you don't, I said. I've heard that you say that. I'd like to ask you to do something harder, just this once, and I'd like to be there with you while you do it, and if it goes badly, if it's as uncomfortable as I think you're expecting, then we never have to do it again, and I won't ask. But I don't want to go without you. Not because I need you there. Because I want you there. He looked at me for a long moment, the recalibrating look, except slower this time, as though the measurement he was taking required more care than usual. Why does it matter to you? He asked. Not defensive, genuinely asking. I thought about the answer for a moment, because I wanted to give him a true one. Because I think, I said, that for 6 years, every room you've avoided has been a room where someone might have seen you the way I've started to see you. And I think you've gotten very good at making sure that never happens, because it's safer not to hope for it. And I think, if we go to this dinner, together, and nothing terrible happens, that's a small piece of evidence against 6 years of assuming the worst. I'd like there to be some evidence. That's all. He was quiet for a long time. All right, he said, finally. I'll come. The dinner itself was, by any objective measure, unremarkable. 12 guests, formal courses, conversation that moved in the careful, circling way of people who had known each other, or known each other's families, for generations, and had long ago worked out which subjects were safe. The Dowager Countess Bellwether was perhaps 80, sharp-eyed, dressed in dark green, and she watched Damien and me arrive together with an expression I couldn't immediately read, until, over the soup course, she said, to the table generally but looking directly at us, "It's been some years since I've seen the two of you in the same room." There was a brief silence, the kind that, in a room like this, was its own kind of statement. "It has," Damien said. Evenly. Not defensive. Just true. "Lady Ashvale tells me she's recently taken an interest in the estate accounts," the Countess said. I hadn't told her this. The information had clearly traveled, the way information did in this world, through servants and connections and the dozen small channels by which a household's business became, eventually, everyone's business. I confess I find that more interesting than most of the things people tell me at these dinners. "She's been very helpful," Damien said. And then, and this was the part that mattered, the part one would think about afterward, he didn't stop there. "She found an error in the East Harbor accounts that I'd missed for 3 years. I'd be lying if I said the estate's finances were in better order before she started looking at them. It was a small thing. A single sentence, factual, almost dry. But I felt the table's attention shift, very slightly, the specific recalibration of a room full of people who kept careful track of which marriages were thriving and which were merely surviving, registering a data point that didn't match their existing file. How sensible, the Countess said, and there was something approving in it, and the conversation moved on, the way conversations do, to other things. But I caught, once, partway through the next course, Damien glancing at me with an expression that was almost bewildered, as though he was still working out what had just happened, and why it hadn't gone the way 6 years of evidence had taught him it would. We left at a reasonable hour. In the carriage home, in the dark, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "That wasn't terrible." "No," I agreed. "I kept waiting for it to be," he said. "The whole evening. I kept waiting for the moment where it turned into the kind of evening I remembered these being. And it didn't." The Countess was civil. The food was good. He stopped. "What? You stayed next to me," he said. "The whole evening. I don't think anyone has ever just stayed like that at one of these things. I kept noticing it, the whole time, like a sound I couldn't stop hearing, except it was a good sound, and I didn't know what to do with a good sound I couldn't stop noticing." "You don't have to do anything with it," I said. "You can just let it be there." He didn't say anything else for the rest of the ride home. But when we reached the manor, and he helped me down from the carriage, another small automatic gesture, the kind his hands seemed to produce before the rest of him had caught up, he didn't let go of my hand right away. Just for a moment, just long enough that I noticed, and he noticed that I'd noticed, and neither of us said anything about it. It was such a small thing. It was the first time, in 6 days, that either of us had touched the other on purpose. I met him on the 9th day, and I want to record the meeting honestly, because I think the honesty of it matters more than almost anything else in this story. It was at a garden reception, the kind of event the book had described in loving detail, 3 separate times, because 3 separate times Adrian had engineered her presence. At one in order to be near him. I recognized the gardens before I arrived at them. I recognized the fountain. I recognized, with a strange lurch, the exact bench where, in Chapter 12, Adrian had sat for 2 hours in the rain because she'd heard, incorrectly, that Tobias might walk that way, and had caught a chill that the book described, dismissively, as the first of many foolish indulgences. Damien and I arrived together. This itself was new enough that I felt the small ripple of attention move through the assembled guests, the Ashvales, together, at the same event, and I understood, walking in beside him, that this single fact was already doing more than I'd intended it to. Prince Tobias found us within 20 minutes. He was handsome, the book had not lied about that, at least, golden-haired, easy-smiling, with the specific warmth of someone who has never had to work for anyone's attention and has therefore never learned to value it particularly. He bowed over my hand with practiced charm. "Lady Ashvale," he said. "It's been some time, has it?" I said, pleasantly, genuinely uncertain. Adrian's memories of him were extensive, but they were the memories of someone looking at him, not the memories of conversations that had mattered to him, and I realized, standing there, that I didn't actually know how many of their interactions he had even registered as interactions. Something shifted in his face. The easy charm faltered, very slightly, the look of a man who has just realized the script he was expecting isn't the one being performed. Yes, he said. "I'd heard you were unwell. I'm glad to see you recovered." "Thank you," I said. "Will you excuse us? I promised Lord Ashvale I'd look at the orangery before the light goes." I had promised no such thing. But Damien, beside me, made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly suppressed, and offered his arm, an automatic gesture, the kind a man makes without thinking, and then seems surprised by his own thinking having produced it, and I took it, and we walked away, and I did not look back, and I felt, rather than saw, Prince Tobias standing where we'd left him, working through an equation that wasn't balancing the way he'd expected. "You didn't want to speak with him," Damien said, once we were out of earshot. "Not quite a question." "No," I said. "You used to." He stopped. "I know what I used to do," I said. "I don't anymore. I'm not going to pretend I have an explanation that will make sense to you, beyond, the fever changed some things." "That's true, even if it isn't the whole truth. But that part of it," I looked at him. "That part is finished. It was always going to end badly, and it would have cost you more than it cost me, and I'm sorry it took this long for me to see that." He didn't say anything for a long moment. "The orangery is this way," he said, finally, and his voice was rougher than before, and we walked there together, and didn't discuss it again, and I understood that this, the not discussing, the simple continued presence, was itself the conversation. It was in the second week that I found the discrepancy. I'd taken, by then, to spending an hour most afternoons in the small sitting room with whatever ledger Damien happened to be working on, not because he'd asked, but because he'd stopped objecting, which in this house appeared to be the same thing as an invitation. I'd learned the estate's shape, the home farms, the timber holdings to the north, the trading interests in the capital that had been his mother's family's before they were his. The trading interests were the largest part of the estate's income, and they were also, I noticed on the 9th afternoon, the part of the ledger where the numbers stopped quite making sense. "This column," I said. "The quarterly returns from the East Harbor warehouse. They're down 11% from last year. Shipping's been difficult," Damien said, without looking up. "There's been unrest on the southern trade routes. Most of the merchant houses are reporting similar." "I believe that," I said. "But look at the expenses column for the same warehouse. They're up 8%. If shipping volume is down and costs are up, the margin should be worse than 11%. It's not, it's almost exactly 11%, on both ends, like the two numbers were chosen to look proportionate rather than calculated from anything real." He looked up. "Show me," he said. I showed him. I walked him through it the way the old tutor had walked Adrian's sisters through similar exercises, years ago, in a different life. Here is the baseline. Here is the variance. Here is what the variance should correlate with if the stated explanation were true. And here is the gap between what it should be and what it is. The gap was significant, not enormous, not the kind of thing that would trigger an audit on its own, but consistent, quarter over quarter, for the last 3 quarters. Someone was skimming a small, steady percentage off the East Harbor returns, and dressing the books to make it look like ordinary market conditions. "Who manages the East Harbor accounts directly?" I asked. Damien's face had gone very still, a different stillness than I'd seen before. Not the wary recalibration of our early days. Something colder. "My cousin," he said. "Edmund Ashvale. He's managed that warehouse for 6 years. My father appointed him before he died. It was meant as a kindness. Edmund's branch of the family has less, and the position came with a generous commission." He paused. "He's the closest thing I have to a brother. I'm not telling you he's stealing from you," I said, carefully. I'm telling you the numbers don't add up, and I don't know why yet. It could be an honest accounting error. It could be something at the warehouse level that has nothing to do with him personally. I think it's worth understanding before it's worth being upset about. Damien looked at the ledger for a long time. You're right, he said, finally. About the numbers not adding up, I mean. I should have seen it. I've been looking at these pages for years and I never, he stopped. I think I stopped really looking, some time ago. I think I've been doing the motions of managing this estate without actually managing it, for longer than I'd like to admit. That's not a failing, I said. That's what happens to anyone who's been doing something alone for too long, with no one to check the work against. Two sets of eyes catch things one set gets used to not seeing. He looked at me, really looked, the kind of look I was starting to recognize as the look of a man revising, in real time, a calculation he'd considered closed for a very long time. I'd like your eyes on this, then, he said. If you're willing. I'm willing, I said. I met Edmund Ashvale 2 days later, when he arrived at the manor for what was described, in the message that preceded him, as a routine visit to discuss the quarter's accounts. He was an easy man to like, on first impression, broader than Damien, louder, with the kind of warmth that filled a room the moment he entered it. He embraced Damien like a brother, which the memories told me he had, in every meaningful sense, been raised in the same nursery for several years before Edmund's branch of the family moved to their own smaller estate, close enough that the two boys had grown up in and out of each other's houses, the only real friendship either of them had had in a childhood otherwise defined by their father's coldness. Adrian, Edmund said, turning that warmth on me. You look well. I'd heard you were unwell. I'm glad it wasn't serious. Thank you, I said. It's good to meet you properly. I understand we haven't spent much time together. No, Edmund said, and something in his eyes, quick, assessing, gone almost before I registered it, made me revise my first impression slightly. No, I don't believe we have. We had tea in the formal drawing room, a room I'd learned, from the memories, was used almost exclusively for guests Adrian had wanted to impress and had therefore rarely used for anyone, because Adrian had rarely wanted to impress anyone who came to this house rather than the people she went out to find. Edmund talked easily about the warehouse, about shipping, about the unrest on the southern routes that was affecting every merchant house on the coast. He was good. I want to acknowledge that, because it matters for what came later. He was good at this, smooth and warm and entirely convincing, and if I hadn't already seen the ledger, I would have believed every word of it. But I had seen the ledger. And there was one detail Edmund mentioned, in passing, about a shipment delayed by the unrest, a specific date, a specific route. That didn't match the date in the ledger for that same shipment's recorded loss. Not by much. 11 days. But 11 days was enough, if you knew to look, to mean that the shipment Edmund described as lost to unrest had, according to the official record, been lost nearly 2 weeks before the unrest in question had reached that stretch of coast at all. He was quiet for a long time. 11 days, he said, finally. It might be nothing, I said. A misremembered date. People get details wrong in casual conversation all the time, especially about things that happened months ago. It might be, Damien agreed. But his voice had the flat quality of a man who didn't believe what he was saying, and was saying it anyway, because the alternative was a conversation he very badly did not want to have. That night, alone in my rooms, I let myself think, properly, for the first time since waking in this body, about what I actually remembered of the book's plot regarding Edmund Ashvale. The honest answer was, almost nothing. Edmund had been a minor character. He appeared in perhaps 4 scenes across 400 pages, always warm, always likable, always slightly in the background. The kind of character a reader's eye slides past because the story has clearly decided he isn't important. I remembered him at the wedding. I remembered him at one of the garden receptions. I remembered, and this was the detail that mattered, the detail I'd nearly forgotten because it had seemed, at the time, like nothing, a single line, near the end, in the chapter after the fire. Edmund Ashvale inherited the Ashvale estate and titles, there being no other heir, and was widely regarded as a steadying influence after the chaos of his cousin's final months. One line. I'd read it and moved on, because by that point in the book Damien was already gone, already established as doomed, already written off, and the story had no further interest in him beyond confirming that someone more palatable had taken his place. There being no other heir. I sat with that for a long time. The book had never explained what happened to Damien in his final months that the word chaos was doing so much work to summarize. It had never explained why the estate's most profitable holding had been running at a steady, hidden loss for at least 3 quarters before I arrived. It had never explained, because it had never needed to, because by the time any of it would have mattered, the story had already moved its attention to the fire, to the prince, to the version of events where Adrian died saving a man who didn't love her and Damien died being exactly as bad as everyone had decided he was. Widely regarded as a steadying influence. Someone was going to benefit from Damien's downfall. Someone close enough to manage his most important warehouse, close enough to be trusted with the books, close enough that no one would think to look twice at the numbers. Because why would you suspect the man everyone called the closest thing he has to a brother? I thought about the locked drawer. I thought about the burned letter. A scene still ahead of us, in the book's original timeline. A scene I now had a horrible suspicion I understood the shape of, even without knowing its contents. Chaos. The book had used that word to describe whatever happened to Damien before the fire took him. Not tragedy. Not misfortune. Chaos. The specific word you use when something has been made to look like it fell apart on its own, when the person responsible wants the wreckage to look like an accident rather than a result. I didn't sleep much that night. I found the library on the 11th day, not because I hadn't known it existed, the memories had always known, but because Adrian had never gone there, and so neither had I, until the morning I went looking for something to read that wasn't a ledger and found, instead, an entire wing of the house I'd been living in for nearly 2 weeks without once setting foot in. It was enormous. 2 stories, with a gallery running around the upper level and a rolling ladder for the higher shelves, and the smell of it, old paper, leather, the particular dust of books that had been opened many times by many hands over many years, was the first thing in this world that had felt, unexpectedly, like home. Not my home, but like the idea of home, a room built around the assumption that someone, eventually, would want to sit quietly in it. Damien found me there in the late afternoon, curled in a window seat with a book I'd pulled at random, something about agricultural rotations, deeply unglamorous, which I'd found surprisingly absorbing, and he stopped in the doorway with an expression I'd started to recognize as recalculating. "You're in the library," he said. "I am." Adrian never, he stopped himself, the way he often did now, mid-sentence, as though he'd learned that finishing certain sentences about before had stopped being useful. "I didn't know you liked to read." "I didn't know either, until about an hour ago," I said. "This room is wonderful. Why doesn't anyone use it?" He came further into the room, looking around it the way you look at something you've walked past so many times you've stopped seeing it. "My mother used it," he said. "I remember that much, not clearly, but I remember being small, and being in here, and there being someone reading to me. After she died, my father had no use for it. He wasn't a reader. And then," he shrugged, a small economical gesture. "And then it became one of the rooms nobody used. There are a great many rooms like that, in this house." "Do you read?" I asked. "I used to," he said. "When I was young. Before." Another stopped sentence. He looked at the shelves for a long moment, and then, slowly, the way a person tests whether a floorboard will hold their weight, he crossed to one of the lower shelves and pulled out a slim volume, worn at the corners, and held it for a moment before handing it to me. It was a book of poetry. Old, the binding cracked, clearly read many times by someone, long ago. "This was hers," he said. "My mother's. I used to read it, after she died. I think I was trying to feel close to her, in whatever way a child knows how to do that. And then I stopped, because," he paused. "Because it felt like something that belonged to a version of myself I wasn't supposed to keep being. The version that missed things. Wanted things." I opened the book carefully. The pages were soft with age, and in the margins, in handwriting too small and careful to be anyone but a child's, were notes. A boy's notes, written years apart by the look of the different inks, responses to the poems themselves. "I don't understand this one." And, later, in slightly steadier handwriting, "I think I understand it now." And later still, just 2 words, beside a poem about a garden in winter, "Me too." "You annotated your mother's poetry book," I said. Quietly. "I was a strange child," he said, and there was an attempt at lightness in it, but it didn't quite land. It came out instead sounding like an apology, for something that had never needed apologizing for. "I think it's the least strange thing I've learned about you," I said. "I think a child who talks to his dead mother through the margins of her favorite book is doing exactly what grief is supposed to look like, and I think it's the people who told you that was strange who had something wrong with them, not you." He didn't say anything, but he sat down, across from me, in the other window seat, close enough that our knees nearly touched, and for the next hour, in the fading afternoon light, he told me about the poems. Which ones he'd understood as a child and which he'd only understood later. Which ones his mother had apparently loved enough to dog-ear, and which ones he thought she'd disliked, based on nothing more than the absence of any mark at all. It was the longest conversation we'd had since I'd arrived. Not about ledgers, or audits, or anything that needed solving. Just a man, talking about his mother, in a room that had been waiting 20 years for someone to ask him to. When the light finally went, and Hattie came to light the lamps, Damien looked almost surprised to find the afternoon gone. I should let you get back to, he started, gesturing vaguely at the world outside the library, at all the things a Lord Ashvale was presumably supposed to be doing. Or, I said, we could stay, and you could show me which one is your favorite. The one you understand now, that you didn't as a child. He looked at the book in my hands for a long moment. Then he reached over, and turned to a page near the back, a poem about a house with all its windows lit, viewed from a long way off, by someone walking home in the dark, and he didn't say anything, just pointed to it, and I read it, and understood, without him needing to explain, exactly why this was the one. We stayed in the library until well after dark. I found Damien in the study before dawn, earlier than even his usual hour, sitting at his desk with a single candle burning low and a piece of paper in front of him that he was not writing on, just looking at, the way a person looks at a blank page when they're trying to decide whether to begin something they're afraid of. You're awake early, he said, without looking up. An echo, deliberate or not, of the first thing Hattie had ever said to me. So are you, I said. He didn't answer. I came and sat in the chair across from him, the way I had a dozen times now, and after a moment he turned the blank paper face down, the way you'd turn over a card you didn't want seen, and I understood, without him saying it, that whatever he'd been about to write, or not write, was something he wasn't ready to show me yet. I thought about the burned letter. I thought about the chapter where this man stood alone and watched a flame reach his fingers and didn't move, and the book had never explained why, because by then it didn't think the why mattered. I thought, not this time. I want to tell you something, I said. And I need you to let me finish before you respond, because it's going to sound strange, and if you interrupt me I won't be able to find my way back to the rest of it. He looked at me. Something in my tone must have carried, because the wariness I'd grown used to seeing in him, the bracing, the expectation of unpleasantness, was, for the first time, entirely absent. He just looked at me, and waited. I don't think Edmund's mistake was a mistake, I said. I think the warehouse numbers have been wrong on purpose, for a while, by someone who knew exactly how to make them look like they weren't wrong on purpose. And I don't have proof of this, I want to be honest about that. This is a feeling more than a fact. I think it's been building toward something. Not just quiet skimming forever. Something that's meant to happen, that's going to happen, soon, that will make it look like everything that's gone wrong with this estate was your doing, or your fault, or at minimum your responsibility to have caught and didn't. Damien's face had gone very pale. And I think, I said, when that happens, whatever it is, you're going to be alone in the middle of it, because that's how it's been arranged, and because you've spent years training everyone around you, including yourself, to expect that you'll be alone in the middle of things. He didn't speak. I'm not going to let that happen, I said. I know that's not my decision to make unilaterally. It's your estate, your family, your cousin, and you have every right to tell me I'm wrong, or that this isn't my business, or that the fever has made me strange and I should leave this kind of thing to people who understand it better than I do. But I wanted you to know, before any of that, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever this is, I'm not going anywhere. The candle had burned down significantly while I was speaking. In the low light, I watched Damien Ashvale's face do something I hadn't seen it do in 3 weeks of watching it. Carefully, it cracked, just slightly, just at the edges. No one has ever said that to me, he said. His voice was very quiet. Not once. He stopped, and pressed the back of his hand briefly against his eyes, and when he spoke again his voice was steadier, but only just. Thank you. You don't need to thank me, I said. You need to help me find out what Edmund's actually doing. And then we need to make sure that whatever he's planning doesn't get the chance to happen. He looked at the blank paper, still face down on the desk between us. Then he turned it back over, and picked up his pen, and began. Not the letter he'd been avoiding, but a list. Dates, names, ships, the beginning of an investigation, written in his small, careful handwriting, in the candlelight, with someone sitting across from him for the first time in longer than either of us could measure. I want to tell you honestly that the next 2 months were not dramatic, because I think the honesty matters, and because I think the lack of drama was, itself, the point. We didn't confront Edmund. We didn't accuse anyone of anything. What we did, instead, was something much slower and much less satisfying to describe. We paid attention. Damien wrote to the harbor master at East Harbor, not as an accusation, but as a routine inquiry, the kind any landowner might make about shipping records, framed as curiosity about the unrest's impact on trade more broadly. The harbor master's reply took 3 weeks and contained, buried in a great deal of unremarkable detail, a shipping log that didn't quite match the one in Edmund's quarterly reports. Not in the totals matched, carefully, exactly. In the dates. 3 shipments that Edmund's records placed in one quarter appeared, in the harbor master's independent log, in the quarter before. He's moving losses between quarters, I said, the evening the reply arrived, the two of us at the small table in the sitting room that had become, without either of us deciding it, formally, our table, the one we ate at most evenings now, instead of the cavernous dining hall built for a household twice the size. If a loss happens in a quarter where the overall numbers already look bad, he reports it in the next quarter instead, where it'll be smaller relative to a better baseline. It spreads the damage out. Makes it less visible in any single report. Why would he need to do that, Damien said, unless the total losses were larger than he wants anyone, including me, to ever see added up in one place. Exactly, I said. We started, after that, keeping our own shadow ledger, a second set of records, compiled quietly from independent sources, the harbor master's logs, correspondence with 2 other merchant houses that traded through the same warehouse, even, in one case, a conversation Damien had, almost by accident, with a dockworker who'd been at East Harbor for 15 years and remembered, with the specific clarity of someone whose job depends on remembering things correctly, exactly which shipments had actually been lost and which had simply been recorded as lost. By the end of the second month, the shadow ledger told a story the official one didn't. Over 3 years, Edmund Ashvale had diverted just under 4,000 crowns from the East Harbor operation, not in one theft, which would have been noticeable, but in a slow accumulation of small misreported losses, skimmed commissions on shipments that didn't exist, and, in 2 cases, outright sales of cargo that the official records described as lost at sea. 4,000 crowns. Enough, I understood from the memories, to be the difference between Edmund's branch of the family living comfortably and living very comfortably. Enough to fund the kind of lifestyle that, on his official income alone, shouldn't have been possible, and that I now remembered, with a slow cold feeling, Adrian's memories had registered, in passing, without ever connecting it to anything. Edmund's new townhouse in the capital. Edmund's daughter's recent, very expensive wedding. Small things, individually unremarkable, that had been visible the entire time to anyone who happened to be looking, and no one had been looking, because looking required someone to first imagine that Edmund Ashvale, of all people, was worth looking at. 4,000 crowns isn't enough to ruin the estate, Damien said, looking at the final figures. He sounded almost disappointed, as though he'd been braced for something large enough to explain everything, and 4,000 crowns, while significant, didn't quite reach that size. It's a serious loss. It's not the kind of thing that ends in chaos. No, I agreed. I don't think the 4,000 crowns is the plan. I think the 4,000 crowns is what he's already taken, separately, because he could. I think the actual plan is something else. Something the 4,000 crowns might be part of, but isn't the whole of. Then what is the plan? I didn't know, not yet, but I had a guess, and the guess had been forming for weeks, getting clearer each time a new piece of the shadow ledger fell into place, and that evening, for the first time, I said it aloud. I think, I said, the plan is succession. There being no other heir. I'd carried that line with me since the night I first remembered it, turning it over, and the longer I sat with the shadow ledger's evidence, the more it seemed to fit a shape I hadn't wanted to see. You have no children, I said, carefully. It was the kind of subject that, in the memories, had been a quiet source of strain in the marriage, one more thing left unaddressed in a marriage built almost entirely of things left unaddressed. And no siblings. If something happened to you, an accident, an illness, anything, who inherits? Edmund, Damien said. He's my nearest male relative. It's been the assumption my whole life, if I died without an heir, the estate and title would pass to his branch of the family. He said this the way you'd state any other fact about the world, something so structurally embedded it had never occurred to him to examine it as a motive. And the East Harbor losses, I said. 4,000 crowns over 3 years. That's not a fortune, but it's exactly the kind of money you'd need if you were quietly preparing to take over an estate's debts and obligations on short notice, paying off small creditors before they became loud ones, settling accounts that might otherwise come due at an inconvenient moment, the kind of preparation that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all, because it's the absence of a crisis rather than the presence of one. Damien was very still. You think Edmund is preparing to inherit, he said. On a timeline. Soon. I think, I said, someone has been quietly arranging things so that if, when, something happens to you, the transition looks as clean and unremarkable as possible. And I think the chaos. I used the book's word deliberately, though I couldn't explain to him why it was the word I reached for. The appearance of chaos, beforehand, serves a purpose. If the years before your death looked disordered, debts mounting, accounts in confusion, a lord who'd stopped managing his own estate, then whatever happens to you afterward looks less like an event and more like an inevitability. A sad but unsurprising end to a decline that had clearly been underway for some time. No one asks hard questions about an inevitability. You're describing, Damien said slowly, someone planning my death. I'm describing, I said, someone making sure that if your death happens, by whatever means, accident or otherwise, it won't look like anything except the sad conclusion of a story everyone already believed they were watching. We sat with that for a long time. The fire, Damien said, finally. Quietly. In the original, in whatever you keep almost saying and not saying. There's a fire, isn't there? That's how this ends. For me, I hadn't told him about the book. Not directly, not in those words. But 3 weeks in, sitting in candlelight with a shadow ledger between us, I had stopped being able to keep the strangeness of my arrival entirely to myself, and he had stopped needing me to. I'd told him, eventually, something close to the truth, that the fever had brought with it knowledge of things that hadn't happened yet, the way a dream sometimes leaves you certain of something you can't explain knowing. He hadn't questioned it the way I'd expected. He'd simply absorbed it, the way he absorbed most things, quietly, and then acted on it. Yes, I said, there's a fire. When? I don't know exactly. Months from now. I don't know if the timeline is fixed, or if it's, I searched for the right word. If it's likely, the way water finds the lowest point, unless something changes the shape of the ground first. Then we change the shape of the ground, Damien said. For 2 weeks, we chased the wrong thread, and I think it's important to include this part honestly, because it would be easy to tell this story as though every piece fell into place exactly when it needed to, and that isn't what happened. What happened is that, in reviewing the shadow ledger again, Damien noticed a name that hadn't come up before. A man called Walsh, listed as a recipient of payments from an account associated with the East Harbor operation, in amounts too small to have caught my attention on their own, but frequent, monthly, almost like a salary, for nearly 2 years. I know that name, Damien said, frowning at the ledger. Walsh. He used to work here. At the manor, he was dismissed, 3 years ago, he stopped, trying to remember. I don't actually recall the reason. My father dismissed a great many people, toward the end, for reasons that didn't always make sense even at the time. We spent a week trying to find Walsh. It took longer than it should have. The man had moved twice since his dismissal, and the trail of his current address ran through 2 intermediaries who were, themselves, slow to respond, and by the time we finally located him, in a small house on the edge of the East Harbor town, I had built, in my head, an entire theory. Walsh as the demolition contact, Walsh as the man Edmund had been paying to do something irreversible, Walsh as the missing piece that would let us go to the local magistrate with something concrete. Walsh was an old man, nearly 70, who answered the door with the wary suspicion of someone who'd had very little good news delivered to him in his life, and who, once he understood who we were and why we'd come, looked first frightened, and then, when it became clear we weren't there to accuse him of anything, almost relieved. Edmund Ashvale pays me a small pension, he said. Has done for 2 years. I don't, my lord, I don't rightly know why, except that he said it was a kindness, for old service, and that I shouldn't mention it because it might cause talk, families being odd about money and old servants and so on. I never thought much of it. Man offers an old groundskeeper a few crowns a month after he's been turned out with nothing. You don't ask too many questions about his reasons. It took us most of the visit to understand what we were actually looking at, and it was Damien, not me, who got there first, sitting in Walsh's small kitchen with a cup of tea he wasn't drinking, his face going through several expressions before settling on something that looked almost like grief. You were dismissed 2 years before the East Harbor numbers start going wrong, he said. Slowly. Not 3. I had the date wrong. I looked it up before we came, and it's 2 years, not 3. And Edmund started paying you a pension immediately after. Before any of the rest of it. He looked at Walsh. Why were you dismissed? Truly, I know my father's reasons were often poor ones, but do you remember what was said, at the time? Walsh was quiet for a moment. There was a disagreement, he said, finally. Between your father and your cousin's father. Edmund's father, my lord, before he passed. Over money. An old debt, I believe, that your grandfather had lent and never properly recorded, and Edmund's father wanted it forgiven, and your father wouldn't forgive it, and there was a great deal of unpleasantness about it, the kind that happens between brothers sometimes, even when one of them's only a cousin by then. And he looked uncomfortable. I'd overheard some of it. The argument. I wasn't meant to, but the walls in the old wing carry sound, and I was cleaning nearby, and your father found out I'd heard, and he didn't like the idea that a servant knew the family's business, even by accident. So he let me go. Said it was for something else. I forget what excuse he gave, but I always believed it was because of what I'd heard. And Edmund knew you'd overheard it too, Damien said. Slowly. And 2 years later, once his own father had died, and Edmund had taken over that branch of the family's affairs, he started paying you. Quietly. As a kindness. I suppose he did, my lord, Walsh said, looking between us with growing unease, as though only now beginning to understand that his small, gratefully accepted pension might have meant something other than kindness after all. We left Walsh's house with nothing that pointed toward the fire, or the demolition materials, or anything that explained the most frightening part of Cole's findings. What we'd found instead was older, and smaller, and in its own way sadder. An old family grievance over an unforgiven debt, decades old, that Edmund had apparently been quietly managing, paying off a witness to an argument that, by any reasonable measure, shouldn't have mattered to anyone anymore. It's not nothing, I said, in the carriage back to the manor, watching Damien's face in the fading light. He looked exhausted, the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent a week building toward an answer and arrived instead at a different question. It tells us, Edmund's been managing loose ends for longer than we thought. 2 years, not however long the East Harbor skimming has been going on specifically. It tells us this has been considered for longer than the ledger alone would suggest. But it's not the answer, Damien said. No, I agreed. It's not the answer. But I don't think we wasted the week. I think we just learned that whatever this is, it's been built slowly and carefully by someone who thinks in terms of years, not weeks. Which means it's probably not going to be solved by finding one piece of paper that explains everything. It's going to be solved the way we've been solving it. Slowly. By looking at things other people decided weren't worth looking at. Damien was quiet for the rest of the ride. But that evening, instead of returning to the study, he came to the library, where I'd taken, in recent weeks, to spending the hour before dinner, and sat across from me in the window seat, and for a while neither of us spoke about Edmund, or Walsh, or any of it. I keep thinking, he said, eventually, about what you said weeks ago, about training everyone, including myself, to expect that I'd be alone in the middle of things. I remember, I said. I think, he said, I've spent so long expecting to be alone in the middle of bad things that I never considered what it would mean to not be alone in the middle of a slow thing. A week that didn't lead anywhere. A wrong trail. I think, before, a week like this would have felt like proof that I was wasting everyone's time. That I should apologize for the week, for Walsh's discomfort, for dragging you along on something that turned out to be nothing. He looked at the book in my lap, the same book of his mother's poetry, which had become, without either of us deciding it, the book I read from most evenings now. And instead I just feel tired. In an ordinary way, the way anyone feels after a long week. I don't think I've felt ordinarily tired in a very long time. I think I've mostly felt either nothing, or much worse than tired, with very little in between. Ordinary tired is good, I said. Ordinary tired means the week was hard, and now it's over, and tomorrow can be different. That's all it has to mean. He nodded slowly, and reached over, and took the book from my hands, gently, an unspoken request, and found the poem about the house with all its windows lit, the one he'd shown me weeks ago, and read it aloud, quietly, in the lamplight, and I listened, and somewhere in the middle of it I realized that this, an ordinary evening, after a week that hadn't gone anywhere, with nothing resolved and nothing urgent, was itself a kind of answer. Not to the mystery of Edmund's plans. To something larger than that. His name was Marcus Cole, and he was, by trade, an accountant, the kind hired by merchant houses to audit each other's claims when a dispute over cargo or insurance arose. A man whose entire professional reputation depended on being scrupulously, boringly impartial. Damien hired him under a pretext, a routine independent audit of the East Harbor operation, the kind of thing any landowner might commission after the unrest on the trade routes, framed as due diligence rather than suspicion. Edmund, when informed, was gracious about it, too gracious, I thought, watching his face carefully during the conversation. The graciousness of a man confirming that nothing he'd built could survive scrutiny because he'd never expected scrutiny to come. Marcus Cole spent 6 weeks at East Harbor. What he found, when he returned, exceeded even the Shadow Ledger's accounting, not because the 4,000 crowns was wrong, but because it was, as I'd suspected, only the visible portion of something larger. Cole's audit uncovered a network of small, interlocking arrangements. A shipping agent at East Harbor who'd been receiving payments from Edmund directly, outside any official channel, in exchange for backdating and misfiling records. A warehouse clerk who'd been quietly compensated for losing specific paperwork whenever an inconvenient shipment needed to disappear from the books. And this was the detail that made Damien go white when Cole laid it out, in his flat impartial accountant's voice, across the desk in the study, a series of payments, smaller and more recent than the others, made to a man Cole's inquiries identified only as a known supplier of materials used in structural demolition. I want to be careful here, Cole said, because I deal in numbers, not accusations, and I have no evidence of what these materials were for, or whether they were ever used, or whether this is connected to anything beyond an unrelated transaction that happens to look suspicious in isolation. I'm telling you what the payments were, and who received them, and when. What you do with that information is not my business. When, Damien said, his voice was very controlled. The most recent payment, Cole said, was 11 days ago. We didn't sleep well after Cole left. I don't mean that figuratively. For most of a week, the manor settled into a kind of held breath quiet, the household staff, sensing something without being told anything specific, moved more carefully than usual, spoke more softly, and Mrs. Pemberton sent up trays of food that neither of us finished, with the patient persistence of someone who intended to keep sending them until they were. Damien wanted to act immediately. I understood why. 11 days was not a comfortable number to sit with, and every additional day that passed without doing anything felt, to him, like a day stolen from whatever margin of safety we might have. He drafted and discarded 3 different letters, one to the local magistrate, laying out everything Cole had found, one to Edmund directly, an icy formal demand for an accounting, one, which he showed me at 2 in the morning on the 4th night, his hand not quite steady, that was simply a single sentence. I know what you've been preparing for, and I want you to know that I know, before anything happens to either of us. I can't send any of these, he said, looking at the 3 drafts spread across the desk. The magistrate has nothing but suspicious payments and a delayed shipment. Edmund would have an explanation for all of it within a day, and then we'd have shown our hand for nothing. The letter to Edmund tips him off that we know, without giving us anything to do about it except wait for whatever he does next, except now he'll be more careful. And the third one, he looked at it, and then, abruptly, took it and fed it into the small fire in the grate, and watched it burn, and this time, I noticed, and I think he noticed too, he didn't stand frozen while it did. He let it burn, and then he turned away from it, toward me, instead of toward the flame. The third one was for you, I said. Gently. Not for Edmund. You needed to write it down, so it would be real, so you'd know you weren't imagining the danger. But it was never going to be sent. That's all right. That's what it was for. He sat down, heavily, in the chair across from me, the same chair, I realized, where I'd sat across from him that very first morning, except now the chairs had somehow, without either of us arranging it, swapped which side of the desk they were on. I keep thinking about what happens if I'm wrong, he said. Not about Edmund, about this. About us. About the 11 days, the demolition materials, all of it. What if I act, and I'm wrong, and I've destroyed the only family I have left over a misunderstanding? What if the materials were for something at his own estate, repairs, renovations, anything ordinary, and I've spent weeks treating my cousin like a murderer because a ledger had an unusual entry in it? It was, I thought, the most honest fear he'd voiced yet, more honest, in its way, than the fear of the fire itself, because it wasn't a fear of what Edmund might do to him. It was a fear of what he might do, wrongly, to someone he still, despite everything, loved. I think, I said, carefully, that's exactly why we're not going to accuse him of anything. Not directly, not with words that can be wrong. I reached across the desk, an unusual gesture, for me, in this world, where so much of what passed between people happened through careful distance, and put my hand over his. We're going to do something that's true regardless of what Edmund intended. The East Harbor accounts are irregular. That's not a suspicion, Cole proved it, with numbers, independent of any theory about why. Moving oversight of East Harbor to the main estate, with an independent auditor, isn't an accusation of murder. It's just good management. It's the kind of thing any landowner would do, on discovering irregularities of that size, regardless of who was responsible or why. And if I'm wrong about the rest of it, Damien said slowly, working through it, if the demolition materials really were nothing, then all that happens is the accounts get properly managed, which they should have been all along, and Edmund loses a source of income he was never entitled to, which he also, frankly, deserves regardless of his intentions toward me. And if you're right, I said, then you've removed his access to the resource he was using to prepare, and you've made the irregularities a matter of public record, witnessed by people whose own livelihoods depend on the estate's affairs being clean. Which means if anything does happen to you after this, the first thing anyone investigates is exactly the person and exactly the timeline that would otherwise have looked like nothing at all. Either way, Damien said, it's the same action. Either way, I agreed, it's the same action. You don't have to know which version of Edmund is true in order to do the thing that's right regardless. I paused, looking for the right way to say it. That's the whole of what I've been trying to do, I think, since I got here, not figure out who anyone really is, underneath. Just, do the things that are right regardless of who they turn out to be. It's slower than certainty, but it doesn't require you to be right about people's hearts, which is the one thing none of us ever really get to be certain about anyway. Damien turned his hand, under mine, so that our fingers were laced together, another of those small, automatic gestures that seem to arrive from somewhere beneath conscious thought, and that, lately, neither of us pulled away from. When did you get so wise, he said. There was the ghost of a smile in it, tired, but real. I read a great many books, I said, in a life you'll never see. Most of them weren't useful. But a few of them were about exactly this. About what to do when you don't have enough information to be certain, and waiting for certainty isn't actually an option, because the world keeps moving whether you're ready or not. I'm glad you read them, he said. Whatever they were. We sat like that for a while, hands joined across the desk, the fire in the grate burning down to embers, the manor quiet around us in the particular hush of very late night, and somewhere in that quiet, without either of us announcing it, the decision settled. Not dramatically, just the way decisions settle, sometimes, when two people have talked a thing all the way through and arrived, together, at the place where action becomes simply the next thing that happens. The next morning, Damien called the meeting of the estate's senior tenants and stewards. We didn't confront Edmund with accusations of murder. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would have been the dramatically satisfying choice, and it would also have been the wrong one. There was no proof, not really, of intent, only an unsettling collection of payments that could mean something terrible and could also, with sufficient determination to believe it, mean nothing at all. What we did instead was simpler, and in its way, more devastating. Damien called a meeting of the estate's senior tenants and household stewards, the kind of meeting that happened perhaps once a year, formal, attended by everyone whose livelihoods depended on the estate being well run, the kind of meeting where information delivered became, by its nature, information that could no longer be quietly unmade. He announced, calmly, that an independent audit, Cole's audit, had revealed significant irregularities in the East Harbor accounts spanning several years, and that as a result, management of the East Harbor operation was being transferred, effective immediately, to direct oversight by the main estate, with Cole retained as a permanent independent auditor reporting jointly to Lord and Lady Ashvale. He did not name Edmund. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew who managed East Harbor. The announcement, delivered without accusation, without anger, in the same flat administrative tone Damien used for any other estate business, accomplished something that an accusation never could have. It made the irregularities a matter of record, witnessed by 24 people whose own positions depended on the estate's affairs being conducted honestly, with no possibility of the information being quietly walked back later. Edmund, who was present, he had been invited, as he was invited to all such meetings, as family, sat through the announcement with his easy warmth fixed firmly in place, and I watched him, and I saw, just once, just for a moment, the warmth not quite reach his eyes. Afterward, he found Damien alone, or what he believed was alone. I was in the next room, with the door not quite closed, and I did not move away from it. That was unnecessary, Edmund said. His voice had lost some of its ease. A private conversation between us would have resolved this more appropriately. Family matters, handled as family matters. I considered that, Damien said. Calm, steady, steadier than I'd ever heard him. But I found, when I considered it, that I couldn't think of a single private conversation in which he would have told me the truth. And I realized that the reason I couldn't think of one was that I'd never actually had a conversation with you, in all these years, where I'd asked you a question I genuinely didn't already know the comfortable answer to. I'd never tested it, so I tested it, just now, in front of 24 people, where the answer couldn't be managed afterward. Damien. The audit stands, Damien said. Cole stays. East Harbor reports to the main estate from now on. I'm not going to pursue anything further, not the missing funds, not the rest of it. I think you know what the rest of it refers to, and I think you know that I know, and I think. The fact that neither of us is going to say it aloud is the most generous thing I am ever going to do for you. Take it. There was a long silence. I see, Edmund said, finally. His voice had gone flat, the warmth entirely gone now, nothing left beneath it but something colder and more honest than anything I'd heard from him before. I see. Well, I suppose I should. He stopped. I should be going. Yes, Damien said, I think you should. I heard him leave. I heard the front doors, distant, closing. And I came into the study, and found Damien standing at the window, watching Edmund's carriage move down the long drive away from the house, and I came and stood beside him, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Do you think it's finished? He asked, eventually. Whatever he was. Whatever the materials were for. Do you think this stops it? I think, I said, you've just made it very difficult for anything to happen to you that wouldn't immediately point directly at the one person who'd benefit from it, in front of 24 witnesses, on a specific date that's now a matter of record. I think that's not nothing. I think a person planning something like what we're afraid of needs the appearance of inevitability, and you've just taken that away from him, publicly, in a way he can't undo. Damien nodded slowly. It doesn't feel like an ending, he said. It isn't, I said. It's the part where the chaos stops being inevitable. The rest, the part where it actually becomes something else, that's slower. And it's not really about Edmund anymore. He looked at me. What's it about, then? I thought about the burned letter. The chapter I'd been reading when I died. The flame reaching his fingers, and the fact that the book had given him that moment and never once asked why. I think it's about you finding out what happens when someone doesn't leave, I said. Which is going to take longer than an afternoon. But I'm not in a hurry. News travels strangely in a world without the things I'd once taken for granted, no instant messages, no broadcasts, and yet, somehow, it travels almost as fast, carried by the same people who carry everything else. Servants, tradesmen, the dozens of small daily exchanges between households that add up, within days, to everyone knowing everything. Within a week of the meeting at the manor, the story of Lord Ashvale's audit had reached the capital, and within 2 weeks, it had acquired the particular shape that stories acquire when they pass through enough hands, simplified, dramatized, occasionally wrong in the details but somehow, in its broad strokes, not wrong at all. The version I heard most often, relayed to me by Hattie, who heard it from a girl who worked in the kitchens of a house 2 streets from where the Dowager Countess lived, was this. Lord Ashvale discovered his cousin had been stealing from him for years, and instead of a quiet family scandal, he announced it to the whole estate at once, in front of everyone, calm as anything, and they say it's because Lady Ashvale found it. The accounts. They say she's been going over the books herself, every week, for months. There was a second version, which arrived a few days later, carried, I suspected, by someone present at the original meeting who'd embellished it slightly in the retelling. They say Lord Ashvale didn't even raise his voice. They say he just said the audit findings, plainly, the way you'd announce the weather, and that was somehow worse than shouting would have been, because everyone in the room understood, all at once, that he wasn't angry. He was simply finished. I don't know which version was more accurate. I suspect, honestly, that both were, in their own ways, that what had happened in that room had been calm in exactly the way the second version described, and had also been, in its effect, exactly as significant as the first version implied. But what struck me more than either version was a third thing, which came to me not through gossip but through an invitation. A second letter from the Dowager Countess Bellwether, arriving less than 3 weeks after the first dinner, requesting, not the standard seasonal invitation, but a private visit, just the 2 of us, no other guests. Damien was wary of it. She doesn't do private visits, he said. Not with anyone. I can't remember the last time she received someone outside of the seasonal dinners, possibly not since my mother was alive. But we went, and the Countess received us in a small parlor, without the formality of the larger dinners, and she looked at the 2 of us for a long moment before she spoke. I knew your mother, she said to Damien. Did you know that? Properly knew her, we were close, before she married your father. She was clever and warm, and entirely too good for that family, and I watched what happened to her over the years, the way the warmth got managed out of her, I suppose is the word. Quietly, a little at a time. By the end she'd become someone I barely recognized, and I always thought, she paused. I always thought it was the saddest thing I'd ever watched happen to a person who hadn't done Anything to deserve it. Damien didn't say anything. I don't think he could have, just then. I watched the same thing start happening to you, the Countess said. From a distance. I'm an old woman, I don't involve myself in young people's marriages, it's rarely welcome and even more rarely useful. But I watched it, all the same. The boy who used to ask his mother questions about the poems in her books, becoming a man who stopped attending dinners because it was easier for everyone. She said the phrase exactly the way Hattie had, weeks ago, easier for everyone, and I understood, with a small jolt, that this particular sentence had apparently traveled as widely as anything else, repeated by Damien himself often enough that it had become, to the people around him, a kind of shorthand for the entire shape of his life. I'm not going to pretend I understand what changed, the Countess went on, looking now at me. Whatever it was, illness, as I understand it was described, I don't need the particulars. But I wanted you both to know that I noticed. That an old woman who knew your mother, and who has spent 30 years watching this family slowly come apart at its edges, noticed that something, this year, started coming back together instead. That's rare enough, in my experience, to be worth remarking on, even by someone who generally prefers not to remark on things. Thank you, Damien said. His voice was rough. Don't thank me, the Countess said, with the first hint of her usual sharpness returning. I haven't done anything. That's rather the point. None of us did anything, for years, while it came apart, and I find, now, that I regret that, a little, even though I'm not sure what any of us could have done differently. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps some things simply have to be put back together from the inside, by the people living in them, and the rest of us only ever get to notice afterward. She looked between us. But I notice now, and I wanted to say so, while I still can. I'm an old woman, and I find I've grown impatient with leaving things unsaid. We left that visit in near silence, and it was a different silence than the one after the Dowager's dinner months before, not the silence of a man bracing against an evening that might go wrong, but something quieter, heavier, the silence of someone absorbing the fact that his life had been visible, all along, to more people than he'd realized, and that at least one of them had been quietly grieving its shape for 30 years, and was now, just as quietly, glad to see it changing. I didn't know she knew my mother, Damien said, eventually, in the carriage. Properly knew her, I mean. I knew they were acquainted, everyone of that generation was acquainted with everyone, but I didn't know there'd been anything more to it. Does it change anything? I asked. Knowing that? He thought about it for a while. It makes it feel less like something that happened only to me, he said, finally. I think I'd gotten used to thinking of it that way, my father, my mother, the way things were in this house, as something private. Something that happened behind closed doors, that no one else really saw, that I carried alone because I was the only one who'd actually been there for all of it. And it turns out, people saw. Not everything, but enough. People saw, and didn't say anything, for 30 years, the same way I didn't say anything, for 30 years, about almost everything. He looked out the carriage window, at the lights of the Capitol passing by. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. But it makes it feel less like mine alone. And I think that might be a kind of relief, even if I can't entirely explain why. I think, I said, it's the same thing the audit did, in a different shape. Things that happen in the open stop being able to quietly continue. Even grief. Even an old, sad story about a family slowly coming apart. Once someone says it out loud, in a room, it stops being a private weight one person carries silently, and starts being something that's simply true, the way the East Harbor numbers are simply true now. And true things, once they're out in the open, can finally start to change. It was almost 4 months after my arrival, well past the point where the original stories, 6 months, would have meant we were in its final act, when Damien gave me the key to the locked drawer. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He simply set it on the small table between us, one evening, and said, I'd like you to read something. If you want to. You don't have to. Inside the drawer was a single piece of paper, old, the ink slightly faded, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft. It was a letter, unfinished, addressed to no one, written in handwriting I recognized as Damien's but younger, less careful, the handwriting of someone much earlier in his life. I don't know how to say this so it doesn't sound like an accusation, because I don't mean it as one. I think you didn't choose this any more than I did. I think we were both given to each other by people who needed an alliance more than they needed either of us to be happy, and I think that's not your fault, and I think it's not mine, and I think somehow it's going to be both of our problem for the rest of our lives regardless of whose fault it is. I keep thinking that if I just. It stopped there, mid-sentence. Years old, older than our marriage, I realized, reading the date at the top. Older than Adrian entirely. It was for my first betrothed, Damien said, quietly, watching my face. Before, there was an arrangement, when I was very young, that fell through. Politics, not romance. I barely knew her. But I remember writing this, trying to find a way to say something honest to a stranger I was going to be bound to for the rest of my life, and I remember not being able to finish it, because I didn't know how to say, I am afraid of this to someone whose father would have seen it as weakness if the letter had ever been read by anyone but her. He paused. The arrangement fell through before I ever sent it. And then, Adrian and I never tried to write anything like it again, because I'd learned, by then, that it wasn't a thing this kind of marriage allowed for. You kept it, I said. All these years. I kept it, he agreed, because it was the last time I tried to say something true to the person I was going to spend my life with. And I think, his voice was very quiet. I think some part of me has been waiting, this whole time, to see if I'd ever get to try again. I thought about the chapter. The burned letter. The flame reaching his fingers. In the book, this letter, or one like it, got burned. Unsent. Unread. A final private gesture from a man the story had already decided wasn't worth a private gesture, made to no one, witnessed by no one, changing nothing. I held the unfinished letter in my hands, in a room lit by warm lamplight, with the man who'd written it sitting close enough that I could hear him breathing, waiting, not for an answer, I realized. Just for the simple fact of being heard. You don't have to finish it, I said. Not for my sake, but if you wanted to, I'd want to read the rest. Whenever you're ready. He took the letter back, gently, and looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen. He didn't finish it that night. But he didn't burn it, either, and 3 weeks later, he gave it back to me, finished, and I read the last lines standing in the small sitting room with afternoon light coming through the window, and I will not repeat them here, because some things belong to the people who wrote them and not to the story being told about them. I will say only that they were true, and that he had found, finally, the right person to say them to, and that this, more than the audit, more than Edmund, more than anything else in this entire account, was the thing that actually changed the shape of the ground beneath us. 6 months after I woke up in this body, the exact span the book had given Adrian before the fire, before the ending that had never been going to happen to either of us, not anymore, Damien and I stood together at the same garden reception where I'd first met Prince Tobias. The prince was there. He bowed, politely, distantly. The relationship between us had settled, over the months, into something almost like the ordinary acquaintance it should have been from the start. Two people who occupied adjacent corners of the same social world and had nothing in particular to say to each other, which was, I'd come to think, exactly as it should be. Edmund was not there. He'd retreated, in the months since the audit, to his own smaller estate, and the silence between the two branches of the family had settled into something cool but stable. Not reconciliation, not quite, but not the slow-building catastrophe it might have been, either. Cole's continued oversight of East Harbor had, in the months since, turned up nothing further. Whatever Edmund had been planning, in whatever form it had been planning to take, we never did learn the specifics, and I'd stopped needing to. The materials Cole had traced were never used. The chaos the book had promised never arrived, because the conditions that would have allowed it to look like chaos, rather than like exactly what it was, had been removed. Damien stood beside me at the reception, and at one point, without any particular occasion for it, in the middle of an entirely ordinary conversation with one of the estate's neighbors, he reached over and took my hand. It was such a small gesture. I want to be honest about how small it was. Not a declaration, not a scene, just a man, standing in a garden, reaching for his wife's hand because he wanted to hold it, the way people who are comfortable with each other do 100 times a day without anyone remarking on it. But I felt the small ripple move through the people near us, the same ripple I'd felt, months ago, when we'd arrived at this same garden together for the first time. The Ashvales. And this time the ripple wasn't surprise. It was something gentler. The specific, unremarkable recognition of two people who had simply, quietly, over months, become what they were now. A married couple, who held hands in gardens, because they wanted to. Later that afternoon, Prince Tobias approached us, not with the easy charm I remembered from our first meeting, but with something more careful, almost hesitant, the manner of a man approaching a conversation he wasn't entirely sure he was owed. Lord and Lady Ashvale, he said, with a small bow. And then, after a pause, I wanted to say, I've heard about the East Harbor matter. The audit, the way it was handled. I thought it was well managed, admirable, even. He glanced at me, briefly, something almost apologetic in it. I confess I've thought, once or twice this year, about how differently things might have gone, in other circumstances. I'm glad they didn't. It was, I understood, as close as he was likely to come to acknowledging anything, not an apology, not quite, because there was nothing specific to apologize for, not from his side of things. But an acknowledgement, all the same, of a year that had gone differently than the version of it he might once have expected, and a kind of relief, on his part, that it had. Thank you, Damien said. Simply. No edge to it. The old resentment, the years of being the man whose wife chased the prince in front of the entire court, had simply faded, the way old bruises fade, present in memory but no longer painful to the touch. I hope your own year has been a good one. It has, Tobias said, and there was something genuine in it. I'm to be married in the autumn. To Lady Marguerite, of the southern provinces. I don't know if you've met her. He paused, and something in his face softened, unguarded for a moment in a way I hadn't seen from him before. She's very direct, tells me when I'm being foolish, which is more often than I'd like to admit. I find I don't mind it as much as I expected to. I'm glad, I said, and meant it, a simple, uncomplicated gladness, the kind you feel for someone whose life has nothing to do with yours anymore, and is going well regardless. He bowed again, and moved on, back into the crowd, and Damien and I watched him go. That was strange, Damien said, after a moment. A year ago, I don't think I could have stood in a garden and exchanged pleasantries with that man. I think I would have found some reason to be elsewhere. And now? Now it just feels like talking to someone at a party, he said, sounding almost surprised by his own observation. Which is, I suppose, exactly what it was. I think that's the strangest part of all of this, if I'm honest. Not the big things, the audit, the confrontation, any of it. The strangest part is how many things that used to feel enormous have simply become ordinary. How much of what I spent years bracing against turns out, once you're standing in it, to weigh almost nothing at all. I looked at him. He wasn't watching the crowd, or performing anything for it. He was looking at the orangery, in the distance, the same orangery we'd walked to, that first day, on a pretext I'd invented on the spot. I keep thinking, he said, quietly, about the letter. The one I never sent, all those years ago. I keep thinking about the version of my life where I sent it, where someone read it, and answered it honestly, and we built something real instead of a marriage made of two people avoiding each other in the same house. And, I said, and I think, he said, I got that version anyway. Just much later than I expected. And from someone I never expected it from. He looked at me, then, really looked, the way he'd been learning to, over months, look at things directly instead of bracing for them. I don't know what happened to you, Adrian. The fever, or whatever it actually was. I've stopped needing to know. But whatever it was, I'm grateful for it, every single day, in a way I don't think I have adequate words for. You don't need adequate words, I said. You already finished the letter. That was the words. He smiled, a real smile, the kind I'd learned, over months, was rare and worth everything when it came. And we stood together in the garden, holding hands, with the orangery in the distance and the 6 months that should have ended in fire instead simply continuing, ordinarily, into a 7th month, and an 8th, and all the months after that, which is, in the end, the only kind of ending any real story actually has. It is a year, almost exactly, since I woke up in this body. I'm in the small sitting room, the one with the desk that was Damien's mother's, the one with the lock I never picked, and the morning light is coming through the tall windows the way it always does at this hour, and there's a ledger open in front of me, though I'm not really looking at it. Damien is at the larger desk across the room, writing something I can't see, and every so often he looks up, and I look up at the same moment, and neither of us says anything, because there's nothing that needs saying. East Harbor has had its best year in over a decade. Cole still oversees it, though the role has become more advisory than investigative. There's nothing left to investigate, just a warehouse running honestly, the way it should have been running all along. Edmund sent a letter, 2 months ago, formal and careful, requesting a visit. Damien agreed to it. It was stiff and awkward, and not a reconciliation in any way that mattered, but it was a beginning of the kind of cool, distant, functional relationship that two branches of a family can sometimes manage when the alternative is simply never speaking again, and neither of them wanted that, in the end, not really. Prince Tobias married, last spring, a woman from one of the southern provinces. I read the announcement with the same mild, impersonal interest I'd feel reading about any minor public figure's life, the specific quality of information about a person who simply isn't part of my story anymore, and never really was. I think, sometimes, about the version of this story I read, the 400 pages, the comments calling Damien the worst husband in the genre, the fire that was supposed to end everything. I think about how confidently that story knew what it was telling, and how completely it was wrong about almost everything that actually mattered. It wasn't wrong about the facts. The marriage had been cold. Damien had been distant. Adrian had spent years chasing a man who didn't see her, and Damien had spent years learning not to expect anything from a wife who wasn't there. But the story had decided what those facts meant, had decided, before it ever really looked, that a cold marriage meant a cold man, that distance meant cruelty, that a person who'd stopped expecting kindness had stopped deserving it. It had written him as a villain because villain was a simpler shape than a person who'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what it looked like not to be, and simpler shapes make for tidier endings. I didn't fix Damien. I want to be careful about that, because I think it's the part of stories like this that gets told wrong most often. The idea that one person can walk into another person's life and fix them, like a problem with a solution. That's not what happened. What happened is that I showed up, consistently, at 7 in the morning and every morning after, in 100 small ordinary ways, and so did he, eventually, once he believed it wasn't going to stop, and over months, the two of us built something neither of us could have built alone, out of nothing more dramatic than ledgers, and tea, and an unfinished letter, and the simple, repeated fact of staying. The fire never came, not because we fought it, exactly, though we did, in our own quiet way, dismantle the thing that might have caused it. But mostly because the conditions that make a fire, the isolation, the unexamined ledgers, the years of two people deciding, separately, that they'd already lost something they'd never actually tried to have, those conditions simply stopped existing, piece by piece, the way conditions do when someone finally pays attention to them. Hattie brought tea in a little while ago, and lingered. She does that, now, more than she used to, and I think it's because the small sitting room has become, over the past year, one of the few rooms in the manor where she doesn't have to be careful about what she says. She told me, while pouring, that one of the younger maids had asked her, recently, what the household had been like before the fever. She meant, though none of the staff ever quite say it that plainly anymore, the way you don't say the name of something everyone has quietly agreed to let become the past. I told her it was colder, Hattie said. Not unkind, just colder. Like a house where everyone's wearing a coat indoors and no one mentions it because no one remembers when they put it on. She smiled, a little. She asked what changed. I said I wasn't entirely sure. I said I thought someone just took their coat off first, and it turned out that was contagious. I think about that a great deal. It turned out that was contagious. I think it's true of more than just Damien and me. In the years since the audit, I've watched it move through the household in small ways. Mrs. Pemberton, who used to send up trays without comment, now sometimes sends up a note as well, asking whether the seasoning suited, as though her cooking were something that could be discussed rather than simply delivered and endured. Albright, the steward, who used to bring Damien problems already half apologized for. I'm sorry to trouble you, my lord, but now sometimes simply says we have a problem, and here's what I think we should do about it, and waits to be told he's wrong, and is sometimes told that, and doesn't flinch when it happens. A house where people expect to be punished for speaking is a house where everyone, eventually, stops speaking. And a house where people discover, gradually, that speaking doesn't get punished. That's a different kind of house entirely, and it doesn't announce itself with any single dramatic moment. It just accumulates, the way trust always does, in small exchanges, repeated, until one day you look around and realize the whole shape of the place has changed, and you can't point to the day it happened, because it was never one day. It was all of them. I think about the poetry book sometimes, too. It lives on the small table beside our bed now, rather than on the library shelf, not because we read it every night, though we do, often, but because Damien likes it within reach, the way you like a thing within reach when it has stopped being a relic of grief and started being simply a part of your life. A few months ago, I found a new annotation in the margins, beside the poem about the house with all its windows lit. The one he'd shown me first, the one that had been, for 20 years, the poem he understood but had never said why. The new annotation was in his handwriting, but it wasn't a child's handwriting this time, and it wasn't addressed to his mother. It said, simply, found it. I asked him about it, once, and he told me he'd written it the night after the Dowager Countess's dinner, the night he'd held my hand a moment too long outside the carriage, and hadn't said anything about it, and had gone to his rooms afterward and sat with the book for a long time before he understood what he wanted to write, and why. I'd spent so long reading that poem as being about something I'd lost, he said. A house with the windows lit, viewed from outside, in the cold, by someone who isn't allowed in. And then that night, I thought, what if it isn't about being outside? What if it's just about seeing it? About knowing it exists, somewhere, even if you're not there yet. And I thought, I think I'm walking toward it. I think, for the first time in my life, I actually know which direction the house is in. Damien looks up again, now, and this time he says something. What are you thinking about? The letter, I say. The one you finished. What about it? I was thinking, I say, that I'm glad it took until now. Not because the years before don't matter, they do, I know what they cost you. But because I think, if it had come easily, neither of us would have known how much it mattered. We know now, I think that's worth something. He comes around the desk, and sits beside me, and takes my hand, the same small gesture, the one that stopped being remarkable months ago, the one that is, somehow, still the best part of every day it happens. It's worth everything, he says. Outside, the East Harbor ships are coming in on schedule. The estate is solvent, and honest, and quiet, in the specific way that things are quiet when nothing is wrong. Hattie has been promoted to head housekeeper. Mrs. Pemberton still runs the kitchens, and still says, to anyone who'll listen, that this is the easiest household she's ever served, though she says it differently now, with a kind of pride in it that wasn't there before. I picked up a book, once, and found a story that had already decided how it ended. I closed it, and I started a different one. This is mine.